Okay, so I should introduce you properly. You are a PhD researcher at the University of Westminster.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. Can you see my slides, or are they?
I can't yet. I think I need to add
Okay.
them from you. Just bear with me.
Okay. Yeah, I've got them. I can sort of. Okay, there we go. Yeah,
There you
that's
go.
correct. Yeah, I'm also
Okay, I'll
now.
leave you to it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. So yeah, yeah, I'm a PhD researcher at the Active Travel Academy at the University of Westminster, and I've also just started as a research fellow at the Centre for Transport and Society at the University of West of England. But I'm going to be talking about my PhD research here, which has focused on school streets, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about their impact on travel behavior. So it's going to be a slightly, yeah, maybe kind of connections and some slightly different perspectives to what we've heard so far. So when I started the PhD, this was kind of the question that was set to me. Can small-scale changes to streets and how they're accessed lead to changes in travel behavior? And this was not necessarily to do with school streets in particular. It could have been any such kind of intervention, but at the time, school streets were becoming more prevalent in the UK, and especially in London, where I was focusing the research. And there wasn't much research on them, so I thought that might be a kind of a nice way into kind of looking at that question. And so I started my research just to the left of this yellow line here, and so this is in January 2020. And when I started it, there were not very many school streets. There's about 50 in London, well, just still quite a few. But in comparison to kind of what happened sort of immediately after I began, was there weren't very many. So now, sort of very quickly in September 2020, that month, there were over 200 school streets installed in London, and the kind of rate has still continued to trickle along since then, and there's nearly 600 in operation at the moment in the city, which is nearly a third of all state-run primary schools. So this kind of explosion in school streets in London really changed how I was able to do the research. I mean, it was also limited by the fact that we were in lockdowns, and so you might notice that the perspective of my research is perhaps a little bit less, a bit more abstracted than some of the other discussions we've been having about kind of what happens within schools in particular. But this kind of abstracted, being able to look at things from the city scale was also allowed because there were all of a sudden so many schemes in the city. And so I kind of developed a sort of ad hoc research approach as things went along. In the middle of lockdown, I was able to kind of interview 18 practitioners and policymakers about how they'd kind of done this big. So if we go how this big spike had happened, how it had they'd facilitated so many schemes going in London in such a short period of time, but also talking about the mechanisms of behavioral change that a school street might integrate with. So getting back to that sort of central research question that I was focusing on. And then I also did a bit of research just on where all the school streets were in the city. And thanks to charity Mums for Lungs and some colleagues at Sustrans, we were able to kind of develop a database of all the school street schemes in London, which is much more complicated than it actually sounds, but very helpful because it allowed for kind of an analysis of the spatial distribution of the schemes in the city on terms of kind of their equity in terms of your various social and environmental indicators. And I'm not going to talk so much about that today, but that's a paper that's available if you're interested in. And then this also means that I was able to kind of look at the Transport for London's STARS hands up travel survey data and get a sense of the behavioral impact of these schemes on the city scale, which is something that I'm going to focus in slightly more on now. This flowchart is just a very complicated way of saying something that is really simple, which is that for a lot of the benefits that a school street might provide, a lot of them are actually realized by having some kind of element of modal shift, people getting out of their cars for a certain proportion or ideally all of the trip. And that extends the benefits out from just the immediate closure area where cars are removed, but also to the general neighborhood. And it also, for certain benefits that are often talked about around physical activity, that kind of modal shift needs to be kind of there for that to be really part of what is happening with the school street scheme. So there is, considering some of these benefits, so if we're thinking about air quality, road safety, physical activity, and modal shift, there is some evidence, and after I started researching this, a lot of kind of very interesting bits of research came out, usually commissioned by local authorities, transport authorities, and such like. So for air quality, there was a really great report by commissioned by the GLA, which saw a 23% reduction in NO2 concentrations at the school streets versus comparator groups, which is a great piece of evidence. Another really, really great report from Sustrans on looking at the displacement of traffic around school street schemes, and also the sort of observing the sort of safety implications of what was going on at those closures. And then some stuff on sociality and the pedestrian experience over there. And then, but modal shift, the evidence has been a little bit weaker so far. This is a report I was involved in very early on in 2021, where we kind of meta-analyzed a lot of the existing sort of monitoring and evaluation work that had been done by local authorities before COVID, and we estimated a sort of 3 to 6% decrease in motor vehicle use associated with the school street from those, but that was a bit of a guess in some ways. There was no control groups. It was based on maybe a handful, maybe 20 schools. And so I thought that there's still really a big kind of research gap on this. So I was able to do some research on this, as I mentioned earlier, using the Transport for London STARS data. And this is a bit of a patchy data set, unfortunately, unlike Scotland. Our Hands Up survey data in the UK, or sorry, in England, is much rougher. It's a bit better in London. Lots of schools are involved in the STARS scheme in some way. And of the primary schools in London, 500 or so had really had solid surveys, so with a good response rate, and with several before COVID and several kind of in 2021 and 2022. And this allowed for, and about 100 of those schools had school streets. So I was able to do a kind of before and after and intervention and control analysis. And I was actually a little bit surprised to see that there was actually a decent effect of a sort of, roughly 4% reduction in car use and 4% increase in active travel associated with the schools that had school streets. We can see here that, not to get too technical, but the error bars on these ones after the school street are a little bit wide, so there's a lot of different outcomes, but it is a statistically significant effect. So that's kind of interesting, and I think sort of getting back to that question of, does a small change in access to a street lead to a behavioral change? I think it's interesting that that is something that was observed, because I think there's also a question as to whether that's enough of an intervention to sort of do that. But this kind of doesn't really tell us much more about what's going on at these schools or what's actually happening. And it's a bit of a limitation of the research. But I asked a lot of the people that I was interviewing what they thought about what was going on at the schools, what was leading to behavioral change at schools that had school streets. And there's a lot of different, I got a lot of different responses and a big range of responses, which was a bit of a difficult thing from a research perspective, because I was hoping to be able to kind of latch onto something and test it in my data, but there was a lot of different things that were coming up. So a big one that came up was convenience or inconvenience. So a school street makes driving less convenient, and for shorter trips, that means that people decide to switch mode. The other one is that active modes are attracted to the space by kind of making it more present. So these are kind of two sides of the same coin in some ways. And the others are, I guess, a lot of other things around that are going on in the school. So these are maybe some of the supporting interventions that we've already heard about. So how involved is the school leadership? How involved is the parental body? What was the kind of engagement that went into it? Was there any, which was a difficult thing in COVID, because there wasn't necessarily a lot of that going on, at least in some of the London schools where things were happening really quickly. And there was no sort of formal model of behavior change that was kind of being used to design or at least understand how school streets were operating, which makes sense a little bit, I think. It's not necessarily seen as a behavior change measure in the way that, say, something that like lessons around learning to cycle might be. But nonetheless, it has that goal of behavior change in it. And so there's been some interesting research that I think kind of gives some context to this. So other schemes that seek to kind of make walking more pleasant while also making driving less convenient have some success in terms of modal shift. And we've seen this with some of the emerging research on low traffic neighborhoods, if we're allowed to say that. And I think there's been some interesting sort of systematic reviews looking at the efficacy of carrots, sticks, and I'm sort of calling carrot sticks. And so that's incentives, sort of disincentives, and measures that mix both of them together. And often this is done on like a sort of city scale, talking about, improving public transport and introducing a congestion charge. But some have looked at it even on the level of improving the quality of the street and removing convenience for motor vehicles. And these seem to be some indications that this is an effective approach to pursuing mobility transitions. So it's possible that there's some kind of interplay between the two at school streets, in that they are both improving the public space and making it more inconvenient to drive. And if that is the case, then there are some interesting questions for designers that kind of come out of that. We need to kind of be balancing inconvenience and improvement of the space. And one thing that comes up a lot is how many exemptions do you provide? How much residual traffic is there? The larger schemes are, the more inconvenient it might be for drivers, but then also the more residual traffic that you might have. And that might compromise the quality of the space to some extent. But it also hints that if improving the kind of quality of the space is an important element, there's also scope for improving the public realm in some ways, and moving beyond, I guess, just thinking about it as a road closure, but also as a road transformation. And there are some schemes in London that are doing that. In fact, the one that's just around the corner from my house has just turned into a full closure and a full pedestrianization with planting. And I think it's a really wonderful new kind of public space. And it's interesting to see that this kind of transformation, there's a potential that that might also be part of this kind of change in behavior. So yeah, here's lots of, I mean, it's a bit squished, but there's lots of references here if anyone wants to follow up any of that research that I talked about. And yeah, thank you very much. That's me.